One of the other things is you often will hear, I know I hear this in clinic every day, a woman that'll say, oh my gosh, I was in a board meeting or I was in an executive meeting and I just all of a sudden the hot flash came over me and my brain went to blank. The other thing is if we have other scenarios that increase our stress chemistry like epinephrine and norepinephrine, things like public speaking or presentations, and we have that narrowed heat zone and cooling zone, we might experience more hot flashes in these situations where we have more stressors, right? So for women, this is often, honestly, one of the reasons why a lot of women leave the workforce during this time period. They feel like their brain fog is awful, they are experiencing these hot flashes and night sweats, and they are embarrassed, and they feel like their brain goes blank when that happens, and they feel like they can't do their job like they used to. Are you navigating the choppy waters of perimenopause? You're not alone, and I've got something that might be your lifeline. Let me introduce my new product, Estro Balance Mastery. This isn't just another supplement, it is a perimenopausal powerhouse. Estro Balance Mastery is a medical-grade formula designed by me to support you through the transitional phase. Let's break down these powerful ingredients and how they work for perimenopause. DIM and chrysin are your dynamic duo for managing erratic estrogen levels that cause hot flashes and night sweats and mood swings. If you're feeling foggy, the flaxseed extract is rich in lignans that support cognitive function and help clear that perimenopausal brain fog. And ladies, if those night sweats are killing your sleep, the green tea extract and broccoli sprout compounds work together to help regulate body temperature. But that's not all. Milk thistle supports your liver, which is crucial for hormone metabolism during this time. The best part is it's 2 capsules a day, and you're giving your body the support it needs to navigate perimenopause with grace. It's made in an FDA, USA inspected facility, and you know you're getting quality ingredients. All you've got to do is head over to metabolicblueprint.com/pod10, and that's metabolicblueprint.com/pod10 to get 10% off your first bottle. That's right, it's 10% off just to get started on your journey to a smoother perimenopause. Welcome back to Menopause Mastery. So in honor of Menopause Awareness Month, we're going to dig into the most common symptom that women describe when we talk about menopause. It's usually not the only symptom, and often it may be one of the later symptoms that show up, but we're going to talk about what you can do about hot flashes, right? So here's the reality. Hot flashes are the symptoms that most people identify with menopause. And essentially what has happened during hot flashes is our thermostat, our thermo-regulation, the part of the body called the hypothalamus that controls our temperature regulation, starts to go sideways. And essentially we're going to talk about what causes that today, what are some of the symptoms, and then specifically what are things that you can do about it. Now, the reality is, again, this is one of many, many symptoms. I've at least counted 69 symptoms that are associated with menopause. However, this is the one that tends to be the thing that doctors associate with the transition into menopause. And, quite frankly, the medical system is only thinking about addressing, right? So hot flashes, again, affect up to about 75% of menopausal women. And they are characterized by this sudden, intense heat sensation, often accompanied by sweating, flushing of the face, the upper body. And it feels like the heat is coming from the inside out. It's not like you're stepping into a hot room and your body's getting hot. It's actually like a furnace turned on inside. And often this can occur multiple times throughout the day. So it is not uncommon for somebody to have 10 to 15 hot flashes throughout the day. And it's often even worse at night where we wake up with night sweats because the thermoregulation not only goes awry at night and will wake us up out of a sleep because body temperature and controlling core body temperature is one of the ways our body actually controls our ability to stay asleep. So often we get to that kind of witching hour after 1 a.m. where we start waking up because temperature regulation goes sideways. We wake up in a pool of sweat and we're hot and we have a hard time going back to sleep because cortisol is elevated, right? So let's talk about what is happening. So we know that as you enter into perimenopause, which is the time period before menopause, and just so everybody knows, menopause is 1 day, and that is 1 full year from the last time you had a period. Now, You could be forced into menopause through a surgical menopause, like a hysterectomy. You could also be forced into a situation where you don't know where your last period was if you've had an ablation, right? So if you're not really cycling anymore with a noticeable period every month, you may be kind of guessing where you are in this process because you don't have something to clock it by. Essentially, the perimenopausal time period that, anywhere from a couple years to 8 to 12 to 14 years prior to the ending of your cycle is when ovarian function, your ovaries, start to fail. And when it fails, it often doesn't just slowly roll downhill. We fluctuate wildly. So one day your estrogen production may be very high, the next day it may be very low, and actually it can fluctuate wildly throughout the day. And it's actually this ovarian fluctuation with the levels of estrogen that starts to cause the hot flashes, because estrogen actually regulates the body temperature directly by having a direct effect on the hypothalamus. Now, the hypothalamus is in your brain, and it is your body's thermostat. It is also very heavily involved with the access of control of all your hormones and neurotransmitters. So think of the hypothalamus also as the director of the show. The hypothalamus is the one that takes in information from your environment, and it makes decisions based on chemical messengers like what your body is going through, what your senses tell you, what your hormones and other messengers are telling you, and then it makes decisions and then tells your pituitary what to do. Now, because estrogen is declining, that thermostatic control through the hypothalamus becomes variable, right? So it's kind of like somebody grabs the thermostat and keeps moving it up and down and up and down. So we start to get night sweats and hot flashes. Now, what else might make this a little bit worse? Any other things that might change hypothalamic pituitary control. So the hypothalamus is the one that makes a lot of the decisions. Again, it's the director of the show that sort of tells us what needs to happen. The pituitary is the conductor of the hormone orchestra that talks to every organ that produces hormones and tells them what to do. So when estrogen is changing the hypothalamic control and the thermostat is going sideways, we may also see pituitary function change, because the pituitary is the messenger that says, hey, ovaries, go make estrogen, go make progesterone, go make testosterone, or hey, pancreas, support endocrine function, and hey, thyroid, let's support thyroid function, make thyroid hormone, or your adrenals, handle stress by making epinephrine and norepinephrine and cortisol. So estrogen's effect is primarily on that thermostatic control. And as estrogen levels drop and go down, the hypothalamus becomes more sensitive to slight temperature changes, right? One of the things that research shows is that different people have different regulatory activity on what they call their thermo-neutral zone. So thermo-neutral zone is what is your body's natural swing between its low end and its high end of temperature control. So for example, I tend to run a little bit cold. So 98.6 to me is almost like a high temperature. I don't run that high. I'm much lower than that. I'm in like 97 is kind of where my temperature tends to average. And so I have a wide thermo-neutral zone, right? So I have a wide swing for my body to assume natural temperature variation. Now, this thermo-neutral zone is the temperature range in which your body doesn't need to actively cool or warm itself, right? So it doesn't kick into overdrive. The hypothalamus doesn't say, hey, I need to cause sweating to help us cool down, because that's what sweating does. Sweating is a way for our body to exhaust heat, right? So if my thermo-neutral zone is wide, I'm more likely to have less hot flashes. So I hate to say this, I've never had a hot flash. I know I was with a friend this weekend and she's like, oh my God, they're horrible. And I've had millions of them. That was not mine. And it's because my thermo-neutral zone is pretty wide. Now, if I'm somebody that has a real narrow zone, so let's say you're 98.6 to 98.1, your zone is really narrow. Now, what we know is in most menopausal women, that zone narrows even more. So our temperature fluctuation that we experience, whether we're covered with blankets or we're in a room, is going to be more hair trigger. One of the other things is you often will hear, I know I hear this in clinic every day, a woman that'll say, oh my gosh, I was in a board meeting or I was in an executive meeting and I just all of a sudden the hot flash came over me and my brain went to blank. The other thing is we have other scenarios that increase our stress chemistry like epinephrine and norepinephrine, things like public speaking or presentations, and we have that narrowed heat zone and cooling zone, we might experience more hot flashes in these situations where we have more stressors, right? So for women, this is often, honestly, one of the reasons why a lot of women leave the workforce during this time period. They feel like their brain fog is awful. They are experiencing these hot flashes and night sweats, and they are embarrassed, and they feel like their brain goes blank when that happens, and they feel like they can't do their job like they used to. So this is a serious issue. It's not just about sweating and feeling uncomfortable. It is about the body's health and also perception of how we're experiencing our world. We're going to go into some of the health concerns that also are more prevalent when we have hot flashes and night sweats. But this is a serious issue. It's not just something that pisses us off. It is truly an issue that affects our life everywhere. Women will, avoid certain situations, avoid even going on certain vacations because of the temperatures, right? Nobody wants to go to Cancun in July when it's hot and humid if you've got 100 hot flashes in a week, right? So those temperature fluctuations, your thermal neutral zone is going to be varied by person, and it's going to narrow as you get into menopause. Now, neurotransmitters, I alluded to this earlier. So estrogen influences our neurotransmitters, things like serotonin and norepinephrine, particularly. So that's why we see more anxiety. 1 in 3 women experience anxiety as part of the menopause transition. 1 in 5 will experience depression. And serotonin is kind of like your neurotransmitter. I like to call it kumbaya. Everything's copacetic. And then norepinephrine is part of your excitatory neurotransmitters. And both of these are involved in temperature regulation. So when we have changes to estrogen, we actually have imbalances between serotonin and norepinephrine that can trigger more hot flashes as well. So we can see more of that. Now, that's the neurotransmitter and hormone side. Let's talk about the cardiovascular and vascular system. So estrogen helps maintain blood vessel elasticity. What does that mean? So your blood vessels are kind of like a hose. And so when we have a lot of blood flowing through it, just like a hose with a lot of water, we want the sides to be able to expand and compress to move the blood flow, right? So we need flexibility and elasticity. When we have circulating estrogen, when we're cycling and we've got normal fertility, our estrogen helps maintain blood vessel elasticity and blood vessel recovery. I've done an entire podcast on cardiovascular health and estrogen. It's very important to that. And as women, when we're cycling, we are protected against cardiovascular disease because of the circulating level of estrogen. So when estrogen gets reduced, blood vessels actually dilate more easily, right? Leading to the sensation of hot and heat and flushing. So essentially, blood vessels dilate, they get wide or they narrow, right? And so when we start to see the reduction in estrogen, they widen and we get more flushing. So you get the kind of hot redness that you see. That's often just the upper body and the face, right? So not only are you feeling it, but you look it, right? We get that kind of tomato face where we get bright red. Now, here's where it becomes very important. And this is why, let's face it, I get pissed off. I'm pissed off at the medical system to just tell women, hey, menopause is something you got to deal with. It's a rite of passage, right? No man, if they had to go through what we go through, no man would tolerate it. I'm just being really honest. Yes, it's a rite of passage, but hot flashes are associated with increased cardiovascular risk for heart attack and stroke, right? So the women who have more hot flashes and don't have night sweats and don't have hormone replacement to restore that estrogen level have a greater risk for stroke and heart attack. And here's why, right? So I talked about the blood vessel and the elasticity of the blood vessel and estrogen's influence on it. So the lining of your blood vessel is called an endothelial lining. The endothelial lining has a hair-like structure called the glycocalyx. Estrogen protects that hair-like structure and allows it to function. One of the ways that hair-like structure helps the blood vessels, it actually swings back and forth and produces nitric oxide, which helps your blood vessel perfuse and helps your body move oxygen and blood flow, right? Taking the pressure off of things like the heart and the arteries. So hot flashes are associated with reduced flow mediation and dilation, which is a measure of the endothelial function. So essentially, what does that mean? The loss of estrogen means our blood vessels are less capable of doing their job properly, and we get more atherosclerosis, which is plaquing in the arteries. We get more hardening of the arteries, and so we get more cardiovascular disease. So we get an increased risk of cardiovascular event, including stroke and heart attack. And that becomes a very serious risk for women in their 50s and 60s. And this is seen more in women of color. So women of African descent and your Hispanic regions and Mexican, Spanish, we see a lot more risk in certain genetic backgrounds. So it becomes a bigger risk for heart attack and stroke. The other thing that we see is women who experience hot flashes are more likely to experience spikes in blood pressure as well. So temporary spikes in blood pressure can also increase stroke risk. So essentially what happens is the blood pressure is going to change at the time of the hot flash. So we have greater risk, again, for stroke and heart attack. Increased blood pressure means increased risk for cardiovascular event and stroke risk. And you can't feel that. You cannot feel increases in blood pressure, or if you do, like you're getting headaches, it's usually a significant increase. And then over time, these spikes can lead to chronic hypertension, which is a major risk factor for both heart attack and stroke. Now, cholesterol is associated with cardiovascular risk because cholesterol is the ingredient, particularly LDL cholesterol, is part of what the body uses to create arterial plaquing. And one of the things that is well known is that as a woman goes through menopause, we see an increase in LDL cholesterol and total cholesterol. And that is well documented, and it's not from diet. Diet is not going to change it. It is going to potentially cause an issue with altered lipid profiles, cholesterol, and increased risk of atherosclerosis. So when we see that elevated cholesterol and elevated lipid profile, we get more arterial plaquing, we get more cardiovascular disease, we get more hardening of the arteries. Now, some of the other research also shows that we see increased insulin resistance. So when we get more hot flashes, we are more likely to develop insulin resistance, risk for type 2 diabetes, and increased cardiovascular risk because of the risk of insulin resistance and type 2 diabetes, leading to more atherosclerosis, more hypertension, more visceral body fat deposition. So we get more abdominal fat underneath the muscle. So we see this sort of stacking of cardiovascular event. Now, we're not 100% sure why there is this relationship between insulin resistance and hot flashes. However, we could assume that a lot of the research is sort of pointing to an increase in just inflammatory activity. When we have more inflammatory cytokines, that's the messenger that creates the inflammatory response, we get more insulin resistance, which means we get more fat deposition, particularly abdominally, and then we see more insulin resistance, and then we see the overall risk go up. The other thing we see is just as a whole, women, when they go through menopause, have increased visceral fat deposition. So that's a fancy way of saying abdominal fat goes up with the same diet, same exercise as what you were doing before because of the loss of estrogen, right? So this increases our risk also. So women with hot flashes are going to have an increased risk of insulin resistance. And again, things like chronic inflammation are going to contribute to that. Now, we have our sympathetic nervous system and our parasympathetic nervous system. The sympathetic nervous system is responding to stressors. Parasympathetic are the things that you don't think about, like eating and digestion. So the act of eating is sympathetic, but the digestive act is parasympathetic. Your heart rate is parasympathetic. It's the stuff that you don't think about. Now, hot flashes are involved in activation of this sympathetic nervous system, often without a trigger, right? This sort of sympathetic drive kicks into overdrive. And when we have chronic activation, it can lead to increased heart rate, increased blood pressure, and cardiovascular strain. So all of those things increase the risk. So obviously, the next step is what else starts to increase risk? Sleep disturbances. Well, we already have insomnia as a primary symptom of menopause because of the loss of progesterone and estrogen. Hot flashes, especially night sweats, are going to make that worse. It seriously disrupts sleep, and then we get poor sleep quality. So REM sleep starts to suffer, deep sleep starts to suffer, which increases inflammatory activity, increases cortisol, increases insulin resistance, and now we've got this vicious feedback loop. one of the other interesting things is in their research, it shows women who experience hot flashes, particularly early in the menopause transition. So some of you that maybe got it really, really earlier show a greater progression of what we would call subclinical disease for cardiovascular disease. So things like carotid intima media thickness. What does that mean? So we have the carotid artery that runs up the side of the neck that feeds the brain. We often can take a sonogram of that and look at the depth and width of that artery to see, hey, is there plaquing in there? What is the quality of that artery? Because that tells us, as a proxy for other arteries in the body, if it's functioning properly or not, or has it increased in thickness, which means the interior diameter of the artery has become narrower. And what we know is women with more hot flashes, and especially hot flashes earlier in the progression, have an increased thickness. So that means we're losing some of the arteries. So think of it as your O's is narrower and smaller than what it was before you went through menopause, right? So we get subclinical progression of cardiovascular disease. Now, the vascular instability that we see with the loss of estrogen also accelerates vascular aging. So our arteries and blood vessels are aging more rapidly, which reduces the artery flexibility and makes it more stiff, which is associated with cardiovascular event. Now, because we get more cardiovascular risk, our blood vessels are compromised, we have more likelihood for hypertension, and we become insulin resistant, we have a greater risk for metabolic syndrome and diabetes risk. And it shows in the research that women with hot flashes are at greater risk for this, which then raises our cardiovascular stroke and heart attack risk, right? So all of that sort of tells us that we have to double down when we've got more hot flashes on the diet, the lifestyle, the other pieces. And hey, also, by the way, address the hormones by replacing the hormones. And I'm going to circle back to that because we know that we carry greater risk. Now, the other thing that happens with hot flashes and night sweats is when we have these wild changes or these rapid changes in blood flow and temperature during hot flashes, it actually increases another thing called oxidative stress. So oxidative stress is the act of resting. Our body produces oxidative things all the time, and we have environmental chemicals that are oxidative. Well, when we have hot flashes and night sweats, so the overall risk for resting increases. Right, increases, so we actually have a greater contribution and progression to cardiovascular disease and oxidative stress. Some studies also suggest that women who get more hot flashes may have alterations in what we call coagulation factors, right? So women who get hot flashes may be at greater risk for deep vein thrombosis or blood clots. And again, it's because estrogen has this protective effect on the blood vessels and arteries. Now, it's a complex puzzle to also unwind. So the other thing is your average physician is probably not looking at you and addressing your hormone imbalance and the cardiovascular risk associated with your symptoms of hot flashes and night sweats. Let's face it, most physicians, including your OB-gynecologist, if they're lucky, they got 3 hours of training for menopause, and they also don't pay attention to cardiovascular risk because they're more worried about your reproductive organs. So the other part is you want to make sure you're working with somebody that's looking at the totality of your health, not just applying hormones or just making sure that you have, don't have vaginal dryness, right? It's important to get a whole picture, which is why functional medicine is so important, is when you silo medical treatment into specialists, each person says, well, that's not my department. You need to go speak to cardiology. Well, cardiology doesn't want to talk to you until after you've had an event. You know what I mean? Like they're just, oh, you're fine. We'll check you next year. When you could be developing disease subclinically for a long time before an event occurs. And women are more likely to die from our first stroke or heart attack. So the reality is we need to look at this in totality. And if you're a woman who's going through hot flashes and night sweats, we need to ramp up our preventative measures, right? Because there is a relationship between those hot flashes, night sweats, and cardiovascular risk. Right. So let's talk about management strategies. So I'm a nutritionist by training, right? Multiple master's activities, PhD, systems biology. Nutrition absolutely helps. What you eat, how you eat, when you eat, the exercise you do, the sleep, lifestyle, meditation, all those things help. I'm going to say this, and I'm going to say this hard because I see it all the time on Instagram and social media. You have people out there promoting that you can rebalance, and I'm air quoting this, your hormones by taking herbs and restoring herbal function with herbs and vitamins. And that is complete and utter bullshit. Now, let me say this. You can modulate and improve symptoms, and I'm going to talk about the herbs that help improve hot flash symptoms, but it is not going to replace the hormones that your body is no longer making because the ovaries are no longer functional. Let me say that again. You cannot replace hormones with herbs. So, hormone therapy by using bioidentical hormones to replace estrogen, progesterone, testosterone, DHEA if necessary is the only way to restore estrogen back to its protective effects to protect the brain, the heart, the bones, the arteries, all of that, right? That is the reality. Now, with that being said, I add the diet, the lifestyle, the stress reduction, all those other things on top, and I use herbs to improve that, but I won't say that hormone replacement therapy comes after that. It should come before that. Nobody should be withholding your opportunity to get hormone therapy by saying, oh, you need to exercise first and do diet, then we'll consider hormones. The loss of estrogen, the loss of progesterone, and testosterone affect all of the things between weight gain, hot flashes, night sweats. Every symptom is driven by the loss of those hormones. That means every symptom is also improved by restoring hormone balance. Lifestyle modifications, diet, nutrition, all those things on top of it help. I get so frustrated because I feel like particularly people in my arena are often led to believe that, hey, you can add some B vitamins, methylated B vitamins, some herbs, and you're going to restore balance. That's not true. Now, can I restore balance to insulin, pancreatic function, and reduce fat storage mechanisms by restoring nutritional balance? Absolutely, but I'm not going to restore ovarian function, right? So I'm a proponent and fan for hormone replacement. That's why I created my telemedicine company, Minerva, that does hormone replacement across the United States because I know that this is necessary, and I am so frustrated with women being gaslit by medicine. Number 2, diet and lifestyle absolutely play a role. So we want to make sure that we're doing the right diet and lifestyle, and I'll talk about that. I've talked about it ad nauseum on the podcast, so I'll talk about it again throughout the Menopause Awareness Month of October, so we can talk about what are the diet and lifestyle things that are most effective for women in menopause. And then if you're not a candidate for hormones, right? There are cases where women may not be a candidate or they don't do well on them. Maybe they never did well even when they were cycling. There are some herbs that have been shown to improve hot flashes and night sweats, right? One of those herbs are things like black cohosh, red clover, green tea extracts. All of those things help modulate the thermo-regulatory control that estrogen normally has and have been shown in research to improve hot flashes and night sweats. So things like my MenoBalance Mastery product, it's one of the products I created, is designed to help modulate some of those pathways to help reduce hot flashes and night sweats and support the menopausal woman. They do not bring back your estrogen. I wish they would. That would be awesome if we could do that. But they will improve those overall symptoms. And even the woman who may be on hormone replacement, right, adequately adjusted, these herbs can often help. And they've been studied, not extensively, but they have been studied along with bioidentical hormone replacement, right? So using things like black cohosh, otherwise known as Vitex, red clover, green tea extracts, all of those things can absolutely help, right? And like I said, that's why I created MenoBalance Mastery of my metabolic blueprint products. That product absolutely can help with hot flashes, especially if you take them at night. And sometimes I have people take 2 at night and 2 in the morning. So let me summarize what you want to get out of this podcast. So first and foremost, right, hot flashes and night sweats are not just frustrating, right? Not just, embarrassing. They actually are from the fact that your thermo-regulatory control is no longer being managed by estrogen. And the more frequent you get them, the more likely you are to be at risk for stroke and heart attack. And the more increased risk you have for cardiovascular disease, atherosclerosis, which is hardening of the arteries, and stroke risk. And it's going to be likely that you have increased risk for metabolic syndrome, hypertension, increased cholesterol, insulin resistance, and a type 2 diabetes risk along with it. Now, taking hormones and actually restoring minimal amounts that are biologically effective to reduce those risks are nowhere close to what you were when you were cycling. Nowhere close, right? So restoring hormones to that balance helps. And then doing diet and lifestyle to make sure that you're not getting blood sugar fluctuation, to improve your insulin control will all help those things. And then the herbs on top of it can also help reduce those symptoms. And when you do that as a 1, 2, 3 punch, basically, you get a knockout on your hormones and your hot flashes and night sweats, right? So if you are a woman struggling with these, go back and listen to this podcast, get the answers that you need. And then I would say demand from your healthcare providers that they help you address not only the symptoms, but the overall risk that is associated with them. And if you need the help there, you can reach out to us at getminerva.com, and we will actually help you figure out what your next best step is. Because at the end of the day, you shouldn't have to struggle and you shouldn't have to carry increased risk for all-cause mortality because you're a menopausal woman. All right. So thank you for listening to Menopause Mastery Podcast. If this was a helpful podcast for you, please share it with a friend because together we rise. And I'll be back with you next week. Thank you so much for tuning in to the Menopause Mastery Podcast. You are why I'm here, and I am so very grateful. Hit subscribe so you don't miss any wisdom on creating the most exceptional life on our terms. If this episode has helped you in any way, please share it with a friend to spread the love, and together we rise. You can follow me on social media at Betty Murray, PhD, and you can reach me online at bettymurray.com.